Hello everyone and welcome. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this time with us tonight, settling into a moment where you can truly relax and let your mind travel backward through the deep wells of human history. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment, just a simple breath. Let the day settle around you. Feel your shoulders dropping, your breath becoming slower and more intentional. That's good. Because tonight, we're going to journey together into a world that most of us can barely imagine. A time when Europe was transformed into something utterly unrecognizable, a frozen desert of ice and wind and endless cold. This journey will take us back 26,000 years, to a moment in time that will reshape how you think about human resilience, human creativity, and the profound connection our ancestors had with a world that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of this vast expanse of white. The year, if we must assign it a modern measurement, is roughly 21,000 years before our time. The place is Europe. Not the Europe of rolling vineyards and medieval castles and bustling cities that we know today, but a Europe that would seem almost alien if you could somehow transport yourself there. This continent, which today is home to nearly 1 billion people, was then inhabited by scattered bands of hunters whose numbers would barely fill a modern stadium. And yet these people, your ancestors, looked out upon a landscape of such extremity that it demanded everything they had to offer. They survived. More than that, they flourished, created art, built structures, maintained trade networks that stretched hundreds of kilometers across the frozen wastes. They did not merely endure, they adapted with such sophistication and determination that their legacy echoes through our DNA even now. As we settle into this narrative together, I want you to understand something fundamental. We're not talking about primitive people. We're talking about humans with minds as sharp as yours, with emotions as complex as yours, with the capacity to love, to create, to dream, and to fear. The only difference between them and us is that they lived in a different world, a harsher world, a more immediate world, a world where every choice could mean the difference between survival and death. And yet, in many ways, they were freer than we are. They were not burdened by mortgages or emails, or the endless noise of digital connectivity. They lived in direct relationship with the earth, with the seasons, with the migrations of great animals and the cycles of stars that moved across their night sky. As we journey through their world together, you might find yourself envying certain aspects of their existence, even as you recognize the brutal difficulties they faced. Let me invite you now to settle deeper into comfort. Perhaps you're lying in bed, the weight of your body sinking into the mattress. Perhaps you're in a chair, your head resting against something soft. Wherever you are, allow yourself to become still. Notice the temperature of the air around you, pleasantly cool perhaps, or warmly neutral. This comfort you feel right now, this safety, this is something your ancient ancestors had to work incredibly hard to create for themselves. And as we journey together, we'll explore how they did it, what they saw, what they felt, what they experienced in a world transformed by ice. The story we're about to explore spans roughly 6,000 years of human history, though to us modern people, accustomed to our rapid pace of change, that seems almost incomprehensibly long. To our ancestors, it would have been approximately 240 generations of human life. Imagine 240 generations. That's your great-great-great-grandmother, going back and back and back through time, 240 times over. That's how much of human experience, human knowledge, human memory had to be preserved and passed forward through the cold, through the ice, through the constant struggle for survival. It's almost impossible to grasp, and yet we must try, because understanding this helps us understand who we are and where we come from. Now, take a moment with me. Breathe slowly and deeply. Imagine the cold. Not the quick, shocking cold of stepping outside on a winter morning, but a deeper, more fundamental cold. A cold that seeps through your clothing, through your skin, into your very bones. A cold that's not occasional but constant, that shapes every hour of every day. The temperatures in the heart of the European continent during the last glacial maximum, which is the fancy scientific term for the most extreme point in this ice age, around 21,000 years ago, sometimes dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. That's minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit as well, since those two scales meet at that point. Can you imagine living in such cold? Not for a winter, not for a few months, but for your entire life, year after year after year. This is the world our story is about. This is what early humans saw when Europe turned into a frozen desert. Before we descend into the depth of the cold, I want to establish something. Archaeologists and paleoclimatologists have left us gifts, evidence preserved in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers, in the bones of animals, in stone tools, in the remains of ancient dwellings. We can read these gifts like pages in a book. We know roughly what the temperature was. We know what plants grew where. We know what animals lived and died across this landscape. We can see the evidence of human occupation, their hearths, their tools, their art, their homes. And from all of this evidence, we can construct a narrative that's grounded in real, verifiable facts. Now, there are gaps in this story, moments where we must thoughtfully speculate, where we must say perhaps, or we theorize that. I will be clear about these moments with you. But the core of this story, the environmental transformation, the human adaptation, the remarkable creativity and resilience, this is all real. Let's begin then by traveling backward in time. We're going to move slowly, allowing your mind to adjust to each new epoch, each new layer of the past. As we do, I want you to notice how your breathing has perhaps slowed further, how the concerns of your modern day are beginning to dissolve like mist. We're moving now, backward through time, past the Industrial Revolution, past the medieval period, past the rise of agriculture, past the first cities. We're going back, past 10,000 years ago, past 15,000 years, and now we arrive, settling gently, at the threshold of our story. We're standing at approximately 26,000 years ago, at the beginning of the descent into the cold. To understand what our ancestors experienced when Europe turned into a frozen desert, we must first understand what they knew before. We must understand the world they were leaving behind, the world that was being taken from them, even as they adapted to the new world emerging in its place. 26,000 years ago, Europe was still warm by the standards of the Ice Age. Oh, this was not tropical. This was not the Mediterranean climate of modern times, but it was habitable. It was livable. Human populations across the continent, particularly in what we now call France, Germany, and Central Europe, had established themselves in a pattern of seasonal migration and settlement that had worked for thousands of years. These were people of the Gravettian culture, an archaeological designation that tells us they used particular stone tool technologies and followed particular hunting and gathering patterns. Take a moment now to imagine this earlier Europe. Imagine you're standing on a landscape that's neither fully temperate nor fully Arctic. The temperature during winter might drop to -10 or -15 degrees Celsius. Cold by modern standards, certainly, but not the bone-shattering cold of what was coming. The summers were cool but livable, allowing for the growth of mixed vegetation. There were forests in some areas, not the dense, unbroken forests of a truly warm climate, but rather open woodlands with clearings and meadows interspersed. The air itself, while clean and clear, was less dusty than it would become. The wind was present, but not the constant howling wind that would later dominate. The animals in this earlier period were numerous and varied. The woolly mammoth was abundant across the steppe regions, particularly toward the east and north. These were not solitary creatures, but members of herds that could number in the hundreds. The reindeer ranged across vast territories, their populations in the millions, moving in seasonal patterns that followed the availability of plants and the search for better grazing. Wild horses roamed the open grasslands, their sturdy frames adapted to cold climates. There were woolly rhinos, strange, massive creatures now extinct, covered in thick fur, their horns extending upward and then forward. There were wild cattle, aurochs, with their tremendous horns spreading nearly 2 meters across. There were bears and wolves and saber-toothed cats and giant short-faced bears that stood taller than a man could reach on tiptoes. The human communities that hunted these animals were organized, intelligent, and increasingly sophisticated. They were not scattered, desperate bands barely surviving from day to day. They had developed specialized tools for different hunting tasks. They had created art, carved figurines of bone and ivory that we still find today, small sculptures often depicting women with emphasized forms, the famous Venus figurines that have survived the millennia. They had developed systems of trade that allowed raw materials to move hundreds of kilometers across the landscape. Shells from the Mediterranean coast have been found in settlements in Central Europe, transported overland through social networks that must have been stable and intentional. Flint from specific quarries has been identified hundreds of kilometers from its source, moved purposefully, traded perhaps as a valued commodity or as a gift that sealed alliances between groups. Imagine yourself as a member of one of these Gravettian communities. You know your territory intimately. You know where the reindeer are most likely to congregate in spring. You know which river valleys offer shelter from the worst of the winter winds. You know which plants are edible and when they ripen. You know the location of good stone for making tools, flint deposits, bone for carving, wood for making fire. Your family has been in this territory for generations. Your grandparents' knew these same valleys, these same hills, these same star patterns that emerge in your night sky. You have created a life that works, that sustains you and your people. The rhythms are predictable. The seasons turn in their expected patterns. Life, while never easy, has achieved a kind of equilibrium. As you sit by your fire in the evening, and fires were central to these people's existence, both practically for warmth and symbolically for gathering and community, you might feel a contentment. You have food stored from the fall hunts. You have clothing made from the hides of animals you have killed. You have ornaments made from bone and shell and ivory that mark you as part of a community, that connect you to distant relatives and trading partners. You have language that allows you to teach your children the accumulated knowledge of generations. You have stories, creation stories perhaps, stories about why the animals are the way they are, stories about ancestors and spirits. You have art. You make beauty. When you carve a small figurine of a woman from mammoth ivory, you're not simply passing time. You're expressing something about your understanding of the world, something spiritual, perhaps something connected to fertility and survival, and the feminine power that brings new life into your world. This, then, was the Europe of 26,000 years ago. Not paradise, but a world of balance, of possibility, of stability. A world that was about to change in ways that would test your ancestors to the very limits of their capacity to adapt. Now, let your body settle even deeper into comfort. Feel the quiet of this moment. In the relative stability of that earlier time, your ancestors would have experienced many evenings like this. Moments of rest, moments of safety, moments where the immediate pressures of survival were satisfied, and they could simply exist, could simply be. These moments were precious to them as they are to you, and they were about to become rarer. Between 26,000 and 24,000 years ago, something imperceptible at first began to shift. The climate started its relentless descent toward the deepest cold. This was not a sudden change. The human brain is not necessarily attuned to the kind of very gradual shifts that occur across decades and centuries. But across generations, change accumulates. The grandfather notices that winter seems longer than it was in his youth. The mother sees that her children must be clothed more heavily than she had been. The hunter recognizes that the herds of reindeer are migrating earlier than they used to, that the patterns of animal movement are shifting in ways that are subtle but meaningful. The first sign would have been in the length of the seasons. Summers that had once been reliably warm and long began to shorten. The growing season for plants contracted. The window of time when a woman could gather plant materials, seeds, roots, berries, began to narrow. The availability of these plant resources, which in earlier periods had probably contributed significantly to the diet of human communities, began to decline. This meant an increased dependence on hunting. It meant that the success of a hunt became even more critical to survival. It meant that the focus of daily life, already heavily oriented toward hunting, became even more centered on this activity. The vegetation began to change first, perhaps, in ways that a careful observer would notice. The mixed woodlands with their open clearings and meadows began to transition. Trees that had been common became rarer. The forest composition shifted toward hardy species that could tolerate increasing cold. In the southern regions where temperatures remained most moderate, forests persisted, but they became increasingly scattered, increasingly fragmented. In the regions further north and east, the transition was more dramatic. Forests gave way to steppe, vast open grasslands with scattered small bushes, with lichens and mosses, with grasses that could withstand harsh conditions. Imagine standing on a hillside during this transitional period. The view that had always opened up before you now begins to change. A patch of trees that provided fuel and shelter begins to die back. A sheltered valley that had always been a destination for winter hunting becomes slightly more windswept, slightly less hospitable. These changes might not be dramatic enough to notice from year to year, but across a human lifetime they become undeniable. The old knowledge, the knowledge of where to find shelter, where to hunt, where to gather, begins to become less reliable. A hunter who learned the landscape from his father finds that his father's knowledge, while still valuable, is no longer perfectly accurate. The world is shifting, and humans must shift with it. The ice sheets began their expansion northward from their Arctic origins. The Fennoscandian ice sheet, which covered what is now Scandinavia, began to grow. The ice that had been confined to the mountains of the Alps expanded down into the surrounding lowlands, cutting off territories that had once been habitable. The permafrost, the permanently frozen ground that exists only in the coldest regions, began to extend southward. The active layer, the top portion of soil that thaws during the brief summer, became shallower. What had once been solid ground beneath a grass-covered plain began to transform into a landscape marked by the peculiar patterns of permafrost, polygons and thermokarst features, signs of the instability of the ground itself. The wind increased. This is almost certainly something our ancestors would have noticed, something that would have registered in their daily experience. As the temperature gradient between the warm air over the oceans and the cold air over the ice sheets increased, the wind systems that drive climate became more energetic. Winds that had once been moderate became gusts. Gusts became gales. The wind was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Wind strips heat from the body in a process called wind chill. Wind can blow down structures. Wind can sweep away the fire that is so critical to survival. Wind can make hunting almost impossible. And this wind, increasingly, became a constant companion to life in the changing Europe. With the wind came dust. The sediment that had been ground into fine powder by the movement of glacial ice was picked up by the increasingly strong winds and carried across the landscape. This process, called loess deposition, would eventually create massive layers of wind-blown sediment across Europe. Scientists can actually measure this in the archaeological record. The amount of dust in the air increased so dramatically that it's visible in ice cores and in sediment layers. The sky, once clear, would have become hazier. Dust would have infiltrated every dwelling, every meal, every piece of clothing. Dust would have been something you tasted, something you breathed, something that was simply part of daily life. The air itself became a more hostile element. The landscape began to take on a different character. The forests retreated. The meadows and grasslands expanded but changed in character, becoming more sparse, more tundra-like, with lower growing plants better adapted to extreme cold. In the regions that retained forests, the Mediterranean fringe, parts of the Balkans, some sheltered valleys, these forests became increasingly isolated. Think of islands of relative warmth and greenery in an expanding sea of open, cold steppe and tundra. These refugia, as scientists call them, would become increasingly important to human survival. Take a moment now to imagine the psychology of this change. Imagine being part of a culture, a way of life, that had been stable for thousands of years. Your people have stories about how the world works. You have knowledge that has been accumulated over countless generations about where to find food, where to shelter, how to survive. And then, gradually, imperceptibly at first, the ground beneath your assumptions begins to shift. The herds that always came to your hunting grounds begin to arrive later, or in smaller numbers. The plants that always appeared in the meadows begin to become less abundant. The stone that your hunters used to find in familiar places becomes harder to locate. The wind becomes a constant annoyance, and then a challenge, and then a genuine threat. This kind of change would affect people psychologically. It would create a kind of low-level anxiety. It would demand innovation. It would require your people to be flexible, to be willing to abandon ways that had worked, to experiment with new strategies. And this is exactly what the archaeological record shows us: an increasingly rapid pace of innovation during this transitional period. New tool types appear, new hunting techniques emerge, new strategies for finding and processing food begin to be documented in the archaeological record. Your ancestors, faced with an environment that was changing, began to change themselves, began to adapt in ways both technological and social. The cultural expression during this period shifts too. The Venus figurines that appear frequently in the archaeological record of this time period, carved from soft stone, bone and ivory with exaggerated female forms. These might reflect, some scholars suggest, a cultural anxiety about fertility, about the ability to produce children, about the survival of the community. There's an intensification of symbolic behaviour, a sense that the spiritual world requires attention, that the relationship between humans and the forces that control the environment must be carefully maintained through ritual and art and the creation of sacred objects. Let your mind settle on this idea of gradual change for a moment. Think about how unsettling it must be to realize that the world you know is shifting. Not catastrophically, not in a single moment, but persistently, inexorably. It's a useful meditation for us moderns as well, perhaps. We are also experiencing gradual environmental change. We may not live in a frozen desert, but we live in a world where the climate itself is shifting, where the patterns our ancestors relied on are themselves changing. There is perhaps an empathy we can feel across the millennia with these people facing change they did not choose and could not have fully predicted. By 22,000 years ago, the transformation was undeniable. The gradual descent had become a reality so complete that it reshaped the very character of Europe. This is the period we call the Last Glacial Maximum, though it's important to understand that the maximum doesn't mean the coldest it ever gets. Rather, it means the point at which the ice sheets reach their greatest geographic extent, covering the largest possible area of land. Imagine stepping outside on an imaginary winter morning into a world transformed. The temperature hovers somewhere around -20 degrees Celsius, not the extreme -40 that would occur in some interior locations, but cold enough that exposed skin would suffer frostbite within minutes. The wind carries dust and ice crystals. The sky is grey, not the blue of a clear winter day, but a murky grey filled with suspended particles. The sun, when it appears at all, seems distant and without warmth. The landscape itself would have seemed alien to a time traveller from the warmer period just 4,000 years earlier. The forests were gone from most of Europe. In their place was steppe, vast open plains dominated by grasses and sedges and artemisia, a plant that tolerates extreme cold and dryness. The trees that did exist were twisted and small, hugging the ground in shapes adapted to resist the tremendous wind. In some places there were birch and willow scrub, low-growing woody plants that could survive the conditions. But the dominant visual character of the landscape was openness. It was big sky country. The horizon stretched to the edges of perception. There were no forests to provide shelter from the wind, no dense vegetation to break the eye. The permafrost extended far south during this period. Southern Hungary, Romania, areas of the Balkans that today experience relatively moderate winters had soil that was permanently frozen. The topsoil would thaw during the brief summer, creating boggy, saturated conditions for a few months, then refreeze as autumn approached. This created a distinctive landscape of waterlogged ground and thermokarst features, collapsed sections of ground where the melting of subsurface ice had created depressions. Walking across such terrain would be challenging, muddy in summer and uneven and treacherous in other seasons. The wind patterns during this period were different from our current wind systems. The jet stream, the band of fast-moving air that sits between cold polar air and warmer subtropical air, was displaced farther south than it is today. This meant that storm systems that today move across the Atlantic and into northern Europe instead swirled over the Mediterranean and across southern Europe. The pressure systems were more energetic, the contrasts more extreme. As a consequence, the winds in many parts of Europe were stronger and more persistent. The dust that resulted from this wind, The loess accumulates in layers that are still visible in geological deposits today. Archaeologists studying these deposits can measure the dust content, can see periods when the dust was particularly intense. The most extreme dust deposition corresponds to the most extreme climate during the Last Glacial Maximum itself. The ocean was different too, though early humans probably had less direct contact with it than modern people do. Sea levels were approximately 120 to 135 meters lower than today. This means that the coastlines were entirely different. The continental shelves, which today are submarine features far below the surface of the ocean, were dry land. The North Sea, that body of water that today separates Britain from mainland Europe, was a rolling plain. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, that may have been occupied by human populations. The Mediterranean extended less far into the continents. The Black Sea, which today is a separate body of water, was isolated and freshwater, a lake rather than a sea. The Adriatic was narrower. The geography of Europe was fundamentally transformed not just on land but around its edges, with huge areas of what are now seabeds having been dry land, potentially habitable land. The animals of this frozen desert were specialized creatures, adapted to extreme conditions. The woolly mammoth, which we discussed earlier, reached the peak of its abundance during this period. These weren't creatures that looked like modern elephants with a bit of fur added. They were specialized for the cold in every way. They had a shorter trunk than modern elephants, which reduced heat loss. They had long hair that could be several meters long, providing insulation. They had small ears. Large ears, like modern elephants, would lose tremendous heat to the environment, so the mammoth had evolved much smaller ears to conserve heat. They had a massive hump of fat on their shoulders visible in preserved specimens from the Siberian permafrost that served as an energy reserve. They had large grinding teeth that could process the tough, low-nutrition plants that dominated the steppe. Imagine a herd of these creatures migrating across the frozen desert landscape. The led female, guiding based on knowledge passed down through generations of mammoths, knows where water can be found in a landscape that was relatively dry. The herd includes calves, young mammoths born the previous summer, staying close to their mothers. The males, larger and more solitary, sometimes move separately. The entire herd might cover 50 kilometers in a season following the seasonal availability of plants. These migrations would have been predictable, following routes that had been traveled for generations of mammoths. To the human hunters watching this landscape, the coming of the mammoths would have been an event of tremendous importance, an opportunity to harvest a large animal that could provide not just meat but hides, bones for tools and construction, and fat for fuel and warmth. The reindeer were equally numerous, perhaps even more numerous than mammoths, and certainly more hunted by early humans. Reindeer herds, like their modern descendants in the Arctic, undertake tremendous migrations. A herd might move from coastal areas where they winter to inland areas where they summer, covering hundreds of kilometers. The paths of these migrations would become deeply encoded in human knowledge. A hunt that positioned human hunters along a known migration route could result in the killing of numerous animals in a short time. The bones and hides from such a hunt would be preserved and stored, providing food that could sustain the group through the winter months when hunting was more difficult. Other megafauna species populated this frozen world. Wild horses, hardy creatures with stocky builds and thick coats, grazed the steppes. Woolly rhinos, ancient creatures now long extinct, used their specialized horns to dig through snow to reach winter vegetation. Musk oxen, their massive heads and horns providing protection against predators, formed small herds. There were giant elk, their antlers spreading to tremendous spans now gone from the earth. There were cave bears, enormous predators that sometimes competed with humans for shelter in caves. There were saber-toothed cats, terrifying predators with canine teeth extending nearly 30 centimeters that hunted the megafauna. There were cave lions, distinct from modern lions, larger and more powerful, apex predators of the frozen landscape. The bird life during this period was also specialized. Ptarmigan, birds that turn white in winter for camouflage, were abundant. Various owl species hunted the small mammals that lived in the grasslands. Raptors circled overhead, scanning for prey. The landscape would not have been silent despite the sense of desolation. There would have been the calls of birds, the wind across the grass, the sounds of animal movement, the crack of ice, the rush of water where streams or rivers still flowed. It would have been a harsh soundscape, but not empty. This landscape, then, was not lifeless. It was full of life, but it was specialized life. Creatures and plants adapted to extreme conditions. It was not the lush abundance of a temperate climate. It was survival stripped down to essentials. Every organism in this world was pared down to its most efficient form, the minimum necessary to persist in conditions of extreme stress. And the humans who inhabited this landscape had to do the same. They had to become, in their way, as specialized and adapted as the mammoths and the reindeer and the other creatures they hunted. Feel your own body settling deeper as we move through this landscape. Imagine the silence that can exist in extreme cold, the way sound behaves differently when the air itself is frozen. Imagine the stars, incredibly bright in the thin, clear air, undimmed by dust or moisture. Imagine looking up at a night sky that your ancestors knew intimately that they had names for, that they incorporated into their stories and beliefs. This harsh world had its own beauty. It had its own profound moments of peace. To truly understand what early humans saw and experienced in this frozen desert, we need to move beyond facts and figures and allow ourselves to feel, to sense, to imagine the actual sensory experience of living in this world. The air itself was hostile. The wind did not come gently. It came in gusts that could knock a person off their feet. It came carrying ice crystals that stung the face. It came with a sound like rushing water, constant and wearing. To live in such wind day after day would require a certain hardening of the spirit. You would come to expect it, to predict it, to work with it rather than against it. You would position your camp with it in mind. You would learn to move with efficiency that conserved energy rather than wasted it fighting the elements. The dust, as we mentioned, would have been pervasive. Modern archaeologists studying lowest layers from this period can actually measure the dust content and determine periods when the atmospheric dust was particularly extreme. During those times, the dust would have been visible in the air, would have obscured distant vision, would have created a kind of atmospheric haze. You would taste it in your food. It would grip between your teeth. It would work its way into every crevice of your clothing. It would accumulate in the folds of skin. There would be no escape from it. The camps would be dusty. The fires would burn less brightly through the haze. The morning light would come diffused and grey, lacking the sharpness it might otherwise have. The cold itself was the defining feature of the sensory landscape, not the dramatic, shocking cold of stepping from a warm room into deep winter. That kind of dramatic transition is actually less dangerous than persistent, extreme cold because it captures your attention and you respond immediately. Rather, the cold of this landscape was persistent, relentless. finding every gap in your clothing, every exposed bit of skin. It would have demanded constant attention. You would need to keep moving to generate heat. You would need to maintain fires, even if resources were limited. You would need to regulate your clothing, adding and removing layers based on activity level and wind conditions. The light patterns during this period were also different from what we know today. During the glacial period, the seasonal variation in day length was more extreme than it is now. The tilt of the Earth's axis had a similar effect, but the extent of the ice coverage created conditions where the sun, when it appeared, was lower on the horizon, creating longer shadows and potentially more dramatic and quickly changing lighting conditions. In winter, at northern latitudes, the sun might never rise above the horizon, or it might appear for only a few hours. The long darkness of winter would have been psychologically challenging. The brief summer would have been a time of intense activity, with nearly 24-hour daylight at high latitudes driving rapid growth in vegetation and frantic activity among animals preparing for the return of winter. The landscape itself was not uniform. While the steppe was dominant, there were variations. In some areas, ravines and valleys provided shelter from wind. These would have been premium locations for settlement, places where early human communities would have concentrated. In other areas, the landscape was more open, more exposed. The mountains of Central and Southern Europe would have been either heavily glaciated or covered with alpine tundra, not providing comfortable habitation. The areas that were most habitable were the sheltered valleys, the regions where some protection from wind could be found, where water was accessible, where the animal migrations would bring prey close enough to hunt. The water in this landscape was often frozen. Rivers flowed, but near their sources in mountains or near ice sheets, they might be frozen much of the year. Smaller streams would be ice most of the year, flowing only briefly during summer. Lakes would freeze solid, allowing travel across their surfaces. But finding water that was liquid, that could be consumed by humans and animals, would be an ongoing challenge. This is one reason why settlement patterns tended to concentrate near certain water sources, springs that remained unfrozen even in winter, rivers that never completely froze due to their size or location, or areas where meltwater from glaciers remained available. Visibility was limited by the dust and haze, but also by the relatively open nature of the landscape. You could see far, the horizon was distant, but in winter with snow cover and in conditions of wind and blowing dust, you might not see as far as the open landscape might suggest. Landmarks would be important for navigation. A distinctive hill, a frozen river valley, a rock formation. These would be navigational markers that communities would use to keep their bearings in a landscape that could otherwise be disorienting in its expanse. The sounds of the frozen landscape would have been distinctive. The wind was constant, but underneath that, there would be the crack of expanding ice on lakes, the rush of water where streams flowed, the calls of animals, the sounds of human activity. A hunting group moving across the landscape would try to be quiet, to avoid alerting prey. But when the group gathered at a camp or a dwelling, there would be voices, the sound of work, the striking of stone on stone to make tools, the scraping of hides, the sounds of fire, the crackle and pop of burning bone or wood. At night the sounds would be different. The howl of wolves hunting, the calls of night birds, the movement of creatures in the darkness. Sleep would be interrupted, light, vigilant. Danger could come from predators, from the cold, from the environment itself. The smell of this world is difficult for us to reconstruct. living as we do in a world where artificial odours dominate. But imagine the smell of fire, wood smoke or bone smoke, a distinctive scent that would permeate clothing and skin. Imagine the smell of preserved meat, dried and stored, sometimes rancid. Imagine the smell of animal hides, raw and processed. Imagine the smell of the earth itself, frozen and exposed. Imagine the lack of the smells of vegetation, flowers, fresh growth, the green smell of living plants that would have been present in warmer seasons but absent during much of the year. The sensory world would have been dominated by hardship and cold and wind and fire and the constant work of survival. Take a moment now and notice your own breath. Feel it warm in your lungs. Feel the comfort of being warm. These early humans did not have the luxury of this comfort. Their warmth came from fire, from clothing they had to make themselves, from the heat of their own bodies and those of others in their group. A night without fire could mean death. A failure to maintain clothing could mean frostbite and loss of fingers or toes. These were not abstract dangers. These were daily realities that people had to consciously manage and control. We've mentioned the megafauna several times, but they deserve a more complete exploration, because understanding the relationship between humans and these animals is essential to understanding how early people survived in the frozen desert. These were not creatures of moderate size and moderate presence. These were some of the largest land animals that have ever existed on Earth. The woolly mammoth is perhaps the most iconic of these creatures. Imagine standing before a living mammoth. The largest specimen stood about 4 meters tall at the shoulder, roughly 13 feet. This is actually shorter than a modern African elephant, but the mammoth had a different body shape. It was stockier, more heavily muscled, with a massive hump of fat over the shoulders. The skin was covered in long hair that could be meters long in winter, providing insulation. This hair was reddish or brown in colour, quite different from the image of the pure white mammoth that appears in some children's books. The tusks were truly impressive. They could reach lengths of 4 meters or more, curved upward and backward, ivory-coloured and massive. A woolly mammoth was not a creature to be hunted easily. The thick skin was tough. The massive bones provided protection. The intelligence of the animal, and mammoths were intelligent with large brains and complex social structures, meant they were aware and cautious. And yet, early human hunters did hunt them. Archaeological evidence shows spear points embedded in mammoth bones. We have found kill sites where multiple mammoths were killed, butchered, and processed. We have found mammoth remains associated with human occupation in ways that clearly indicate hunting. How did humans accomplish this? The answer lies in strategy, intelligence, and cooperation. A single mammoth could not be brought down by a single hunter with a spear, but a coordinated group of hunters, using knowledge of the landscape and animal behaviour, could accomplish the task. Perhaps they drove a young or weakened animal toward a cliff or ravine where it might stumble and be injured. Perhaps they ambushed it at a river crossing or at a place where the ground was soft and boggy, slowing the animal. Perhaps they wounded it with projectiles from atlatls, spear throwers that could increase the force of impact, and then pursued it until blood loss and exhaustion brought it down. Perhaps a herd was stampeded and animals were separated, making them vulnerable. The resources that a single dead mammoth provided were immense. The meat, and a large mammoth could provide thousands of kilograms of meat, could be dried and preserved for use over many months. The hide could be processed into clothing or shelter covering. The bones were massive and could be used for construction, for tools, for fuel. The ivory tusks could be carved into tools or art objects. The stomach could be used as a container. The sinews could be processed into cordage. Nothing would be wasted. A successful hunt of a mammoth would be an event of tremendous significance, something that would sustain a group for weeks or months. But mammoth hunting became less common as time went on during the Last Glacial Maximum. Archaeological evidence suggests that while mammoths were hunted, particularly in the earlier periods, as climate became more extreme, the focus of human hunting shifted. Mammoths, it seems, became less abundant as the climate worsened. Their specialized adaptations to cold were impressive, but they still needed to find sufficient vegetation. As the steppe became drier and less productive, as the climate swung toward the most extreme conditions, mammoth populations thinned. The archaeological record shows fewer mammoth remains in the later periods of the Last Glacial Maximum. Instead, human hunters increasingly focused on reindeer. The reindeer was in many ways a better prey for human hunters. A single reindeer provided less meat than a mammoth, but reindeer were more abundant, more numerous, and more easily hunted in quantity. Reindeer travel in herds, sometimes enormous herds of hundreds or thousands of animals. They follow predictable migration routes. Knowledge of where these routes pass through human-occupied territory would have been absolutely crucial. A hunting group that understood the timing and location of reindeer migrations could position itself at a key point and harvest multiple animals in a short time. The seasonal patterns of reindeer migration would have been central to human planning. In spring, reindeer migrate north, moving from winter, feeding grounds towards summer ranges. In fall, they migrate south again. The timing of these migrations is flexible, varying based on weather and snow conditions, but within a general pattern. An astute hunting group would come to understand these patterns intimately. They would know which river valley the reindeer cross when moving south in autumn. They would know the timing, early October perhaps, or mid-September depending on the year. They would know how long the migration lasts. They would prepare for this event throughout the rest of the year. Weapons would be maintained and perfected. Drying racks would be built. Implements for processing hides and butchering meat would be readied. When the reindeer came, the hunt would be intense, using strategies similar to those employed with mammoths, driving herds toward natural obstacles, using coordinated hunters positioned at strategic locations. Early humans could kill dozens or even hundreds of animals. The archaeological evidence supports this. We find kill sites where massive numbers of reindeer remains are concentrated, sites that show evidence of large-scale hunting and butchering operations. The meat from such a hunt would be processed rapidly. Some would be cooked and eaten fresh. Much would be dried, cut into strips, and hung to dry in the wind and sun, creating a preserved meat that could be stored and consumed over the following months. The hides would be scraped and processed. The bones would be used for tools, fuel, and construction. The sinews would be made into cordage. Again, nothing would be wasted. Wild horses were another important prey species, particularly in certain regions. The horse of the Ice Age was not the large, refined horse of modern breeding, but rather a sturdier, more compact animal, adapted to cold and steppe conditions. They travelled in herds and were hunted intensively. Archaeological sites in certain regions show horse remains as the dominant prey species. The processing would be similar to that of reindeer: meat preserved, hides processed, bones utilised. The woolly rhino deserves mention as well. These enormous creatures weighing up to 5 tons were covered in long hair and adapted to the coldest conditions. They were solitary or lived in small family groups, not the massive herds that characterized mammoths and reindeer. Hunting them would have been more difficult and more dangerous, but the reward, the massive amount of meat and the enormous hide, would have been significant. Archaeological evidence suggests they were hunted, though probably less frequently than the more gregarious herbivores. Beyond these megafauna, early humans also hunted smaller animals. Hares and rodents could be snared or trapped. Foxes and other small carnivores could be killed for their hides. Birds caught using snares or nets provided meat and feathers. Fish and shellfish, in regions where water was accessible, would have been harvested. The diet was not exclusively meat. Plant materials where they could be found, seeds, roots, tubers, would have been gathered and eaten. In the most extreme periods of the Last Glacial Maximum, when plant resources were most scarce, the diet may have been almost entirely dependent on meat. In regions with slightly better climate, plant resources would have been more significant. The relationship between early humans and the megafauna was not one-directional. Humans hunted these animals, but the presence and movement of these animals shaped human settlement patterns and seasonal movements. A human group would locate itself in relationship to where the animals were and where they would predictably be. The survival of the group depended on accurate knowledge of animal behavior, accurate prediction of migrations, successful hunting, and effective preservation of the meat and other products of the hunt. Imagine being part of a hunting group during the season, when the reindeer migration is expected. All the planning and preparation of the past months comes down to this moment. The scouts report that the herds are approaching. The hunters check their weapons, the atlatls that will throw the spears with tremendous force, the spear points made of carefully knapped flint, the additional points that are carried as backups. The young hunters are reminded of strategy. The older men who have hunted the reindeer before take positions that give them the best chance of success. The women and children are stationed at places where they can drive the animals, creating noise and commotion that pushes the herds in the desired direction. And then the animals come, the sound of thousands of hooves, the dust rising, the smell, the musk of the animals, the sense of life and motion and power. The hunt begins. There is skill and luck involved. Some hunters will succeed in killing animals. Others will see their spears pass harmlessly. Some animals will escape. Others will be brought down. The chaos is controlled by experience and training, but there is always an element of wildness to it. When the hunt is over and the animals are killed, the real work begins. The animals must be butchered, which is intense physical labour. The hides must be skinned, which requires careful work to avoid wasting the precious hide. The meat must be divided. Some will be eaten fresh, cooked over fires. Some will be cut into strips and hung to dry. The bones will be processed. The sinews will be extracted. The task is enormous, and the entire group will work at it, the women and children as well as the men, each with specific tasks based on skill and age. This relationship with the megafauna, with the animals that provided the primary source of calories and materials for survival, was not merely practical. It was also spiritual. The animals that early humans hunted were often depicted in their art. We find carved figurines of mammoths and horses and reindeer. We find paintings of these animals on the walls of caves. The animals appear in the portable art, on pieces of bone or antler that were carved or engraved with animal forms. This artistic depiction was probably not merely decorative. It likely had spiritual significance. Perhaps the animals were honoured in ritual, thanked for providing their lives to sustain humans. Perhaps the act of creating an artistic representation of an animal was a form of magical thinking, a way of ensuring success in the hunt. Perhaps the animals themselves, the mammoths, the reindeer, the horses, were understood as beings with their own spirits, deserving of respect and reverence. Let your mind rest now on the relationship between hunter and hunted. Think about the indigenous peoples who survived through the hunting of megafauna in more recent history. There is often a spiritual dimension to this relationship, a sense of gratitude, a system of beliefs that honors the animal and the necessity of its death. Our early ancestors likely experienced something similar. They understood themselves as part of a system in which they killed animals and ate them, and they developed cultural and spiritual frameworks to make sense of this reality. By 21,000 years ago, at the height of the Last Glacial Maximum, the landscape of Europe had become almost uninhabitable in many regions. The ice sheets extended from Scandinavia down through Britain and into northern Germany and Poland. The permafrost extended far south. The wind and dust made life difficult even in areas that were technically ice-free. And yet humans persisted. They did not simply abandon Europe. Instead, they concentrated themselves in specific regions where conditions were less extreme, regions that we now call glacial refugia. The primary refugia were distributed around the edges of the uninhabitable zones. The most important of these was southwestern France and the Pyrenees region. This area, while cold, had more moderate conditions than regions further north. The presence of the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the Mediterranean to the south meant that some maritime influences ameliorated the extreme cold. Valleys in this region provided shelter from the worst of the wind. Game animals were present. Plant resources, while limited, were available. This region became a population centre for human groups during the Last Glacial Maximum. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, was another crucial refuge. The Mediterranean coast provided some protection and maritime resources. The interior, while cold, was not glaciated. Animal populations, particularly reindeer, were abundant in certain regions. The archaeological evidence shows continuous or near-continuous human occupation throughout the Last Glacial Maximum in this region. The distinctive Solutrean culture, with its characteristic bifacial stone tools, emerged and flourished in this region. The Mediterranean regions more broadly, Greece, Italy, the Balkans, provided refugia. The Mediterranean itself, while smaller than today due to lower sea levels, still moderated the climate of coastal regions. Islands and sheltered coastal areas would have been particularly valuable. The Balkans, with their complex topography, offered valleys and sheltered areas where humans could survive. The genetic evidence suggests that these Mediterranean regions served as important population centres from which recolonization of the rest of Europe could later occur. The Carpathian Basin, in what is now Central Europe, was another crucial region. This lowland region, surrounded by mountains, had a climate that was harsh but survivable. The presence of permanent water sources and relatively abundant game animals made this region attractive. Archaeological evidence shows that human occupation continued in this region, even during the most extreme periods of the Last Glacial Maximum. In the east, the Don region of southwestern Russia and the surrounding steppes of what is now Ukraine provided refugia. The archaeological evidence here is particularly rich. We find some of the most impressive mammoth bone structures in this region, including the famous dwellings of sites like Kostenki and Mezhirish. This suggests that human populations in this region were not merely surviving, but were creating sophisticated structures and maintaining a level of material culture that indicates considerable social organization and knowledge. These refugia were not isolated completely from one another, but they were fragmented. A human group in southwestern France was not in direct contact with groups in the Mediterranean or in the Balkans, at least not on a regular basis. This fragmentation had important consequences. It meant that regional cultures began to diverge. Tool styles that were common in one region became different in another region. Artistic styles varied. Spiritual beliefs and practices likely varied as well. The archaeological record shows increasing regional variation during the Last Glacial Maximum, with distinct cultural complexes appearing in different areas. This fragmentation also had important genetic consequences. Modern genetic studies of human populations during this period reveal that the human population underwent a severe bottleneck. The global human population at the height of the Last Glacial Maximum is estimated to have been between 130,000 and 410,000 people. Remember, this is for the entire world. The European population would have been a fraction of this. These numbers represent a dramatic reduction from pre-glacial populations. The concentration of humans in specific refugial regions meant that regional populations became somewhat genetically isolated. Different populations accumulated different genetic mutations. The ancient DNA that scientists have extracted from human remains from this period shows distinct genetic clusters associated with different refuge regions. This has profound implications for our understanding of human history. The Last Glacial Maximum acted as a population filter. Only certain populations, those that occupied favourable refuge regions and developed successful adaptive strategies, survived and went on to repopulate the rest of Europe after the glaciation ended. The genetic ancestry of modern Europeans can be traced to these refuge populations. In a very real sense, the Last Glacial Maximum created the genetic structure of modern Europe. Imagine being a member of a human community during the height of the glaciation. Your group, perhaps 30 to 50 people, organised into several families, occupies a valley in southwestern France. You know that your group is not alone. You know of other groups in neighbouring valleys. Perhaps once or twice a year, if conditions permit and if relations are good, you meet with neighbouring groups for trade or exchange of marriages. You hear stories about groups that live further away, in the direction of the rising sun or toward the setting sun. But you do not see these distant groups. Your world is largely confined to a territory that you know intimately, perhaps 50 to 100 square kilometres, an area that you can traverse in a day's walk and return from before nightfall. You live in relationship with the landscape and the animals and the seasonal patterns. You know where the reindeer will be in spring and again in fall. You know which caves provide shelter. You know which plant resources ripen when and where they are most abundant. You have names for the places in your territory: a cliff where the eagles nest, a river crossing where the reindeer pass, a grove of small trees that provides fuel and shelter. These names carry stories. This cliff is the home of the spirit of a great bird. This river crossing is where the reindeer were first created by the ancestor being. These stories encode practical knowledge in a memorable form. Your group has rituals and beliefs that cement social bonds and express your understanding of the world. Perhaps once a lunar month you gather around a fire and tell stories, and the young people listen to the elders recount the history of your people and the land. Perhaps you have a shaman or spiritual leader who interprets signs and omens, who communicates with the spirits that inhabit the land. Perhaps you make offerings to these spirits, pieces of meat from a successful hunt, or carved objects, or pigment. Perhaps you believe that success in hunting requires spiritual preparation as well as practical skill. Perhaps you believe that the animals themselves have spirits and must be respected and thanked. You have knowledge that is precious and hard-won. You know how to make fire in conditions of wind and cold. You know how to prepare hides to make them waterproof and flexible. You know how to preserve meat so that it lasts through the winter. You know which stones can be knapped to make sharp tools and which cannot. You know how to throw a spear with an atlatl such that it strikes with tremendous force. You know how to track animals to predict their movements, to position yourself for a successful hunt. This knowledge is not written down. It exists in your memory and in the memories of others in your group. You have learned it from your parents and from other experienced people in your community. You will teach it to your children. You are aware in some dim way that the world has changed. Your grandparents perhaps spoke of different conditions, a less harsh climate. The stories sometimes reference a time when the cold was less intense, but you have no frame of reference for a truly different world. This world, of extreme cold and wind and struggle, is the world you know. You adapt to it. You create strategies that allow you to survive. You develop a culture that is suited to these conditions. In a very real sense, you have become a person of the Ice Age. Your identity, your beliefs, your knowledge, your way of life, all of it is shaped by the frozen desert in which you live. Take a moment now to imagine this kind of life. Imagine being so intimately connected to a specific place that every rock, every watercourse, every distinctive feature is known to you and carries stories and meaning. Imagine living in a world where your sphere of social contact is relatively small, where most of the people you know are people you see regularly, where distant groups are mostly abstractions. Imagine the satisfaction of mastering the skills necessary to survive in a harsh environment, of knowing that your knowledge is valuable and necessary. Imagine the spiritual life that grows up around these conditions, the rituals and beliefs that help you make sense of a difficult world. This was the life of early humans during the Last Glacial Maximum. One of the most remarkable aspects of the human occupation of Europe during the Last Glacial Maximum is the evidence of cultural sophistication and rapid innovation. Far from being a period of stagnation where humans simply struggled to survive, the archaeological record shows a flourishing of art, technology, and social organization. The Solitarian culture, which emerged and flourished in southwestern France and the Iberian Peninsula during the Last Glacial Maximum, is notable for its distinctive stone tool technology. The Solitarian projectile point is a bifacial tool, shaped on both sides of the stone with a distinctive profile. The creation of such a tool requires tremendous skill. The stone must be selected carefully, flint or other suitable stone with the right properties. The flaker must remove large flakes from both sides, working with precision to create a tool that is thin, sharp, and structurally sound. The most impressive specimens are almost impossibly thin, in some cases only a few millimeters thick. The creation of such tools suggests not just practical knowledge, but a kind of aesthetic sense, a drive to create not just functional objects, but beautiful objects. This innovation in stone tool technology suggests several things. First, it suggests that there was time and resources for experimentation, for trying new approaches and refining them. Second, it suggests that there was value placed on craftsmanship and skill. A toolmaker who could create particularly impressive pieces would have had status within the community. Third, it suggests some kind of transmission of knowledge and technique, a process by which skilled individuals trained others to make similar tools. Beyond stone tools, bone and ivory working became increasingly sophisticated during this period. We find carved bone and ivory figurines depicting animals: mammoths, horses, reindeer, lions, bears. We find fishhooks carved from bone, implements of considerable ingenuity. We find harpoon points with barbs, designed to penetrate and hold in prey. We find bone needles with eyes, evidence of the ability to sew clothing. The sophistication of these bone tools suggests specialized knowledge about bone working, understanding how bone breaks and can be shaped, learning which bones from which animals have the right properties for different tools. The famous Venus figurines appear particularly frequently during this period. Over 200 examples are known from across Europe, from the Pyrenees to Siberia. These figurines are carved from stone, bone, or ivory, or in some cases even made from clay and fired, some of the earliest ceramics known. They typically depict women with exaggerated curves, particularly emphasizing breasts and hips. The exact meaning of these figurines is debated. Some scholars have suggested they are fertility symbols, reflecting cultural concerns about reproduction and population in a harsh environment. Others suggest they may represent goddesses or female creator figures. Some propose they may be related to concepts of nutrition or abundance, with the emphasized curves representing well-fed, healthy women. Regardless of their specific meaning, the existence of these figurines found repeatedly across a vast geographic area suggests that women held significant cultural importance and that there were shared symbolic systems across distances, evidence of cultural connection and exchange. The art is not limited to portable objects. Cave painting and engraving from this period shows sophisticated artistic expression. The hand stencils found at sites like Sulawesi in Indonesia and various European caves are particularly moving. Hands outlined in pigment, creating a kind of signature, a claim to existence and presence. The animal paintings show anatomical understanding and artistic skill. The use of red ochre, a naturally occurring mineral pigment, appears frequently in both rock art and in association with burials, suggesting spiritual or ritual significance. The existence of long-distance trade networks during the Last Glacial Maximum is particularly striking. We have evidence of shells from the Mediterranean coast being transported to sites in Central Europe, a distance of hundreds of kilometers. We have evidence of flint sourced from specific quarries being transported and traded across vast distances. We have found ivory figurines made from mammoth ivory in context where mammoths were not local, suggesting exchange of these prestige objects across regions. The fact that prestige objects were being traded over long distances suggests several things. First, it suggests the existence of stable trade relationships between distant communities. Second, it suggests that some objects had value beyond their practical utility. They were valuable because they were rare, because they were made from exotic materials, because they carried status. Third, it suggests some level of intergroup communication and relationship, the maintenance of connections across distance despite the harsh environment. Imagine being a craftsperson during this period, a bone carver or a flint knapper, someone whose work is valued. Perhaps you have spent years learning your craft. Your hands know how to work stone or bone. You understand the properties of materials. You have developed a personal style, a way of working that is recognizable to others. When you create a particularly impressive piece, perhaps a harpoon point of great beauty, or a figurine that captures the essence of an animal, this object becomes valuable. It might be traded to a distant group, becoming a possession that carries your identity, your reputation. Perhaps years later, someone encounters this object and knows it was made by you, and this knowledge carries weight, carries meaning. This speaks to something profound about human nature, the desire to create, to make beautiful things, to leave a mark on the world. Even in the most extreme and harsh circumstances, humans seem to have a drive to express themselves, to create art and beautiful objects. This drive persisted in the frozen desert. In fact, some scholars have suggested that art and symbolic activity may have become even more important in such harsh conditions, as a way of coping with stress, of creating meaning, of binding communities together. Spirituality and ritual appear to have been important aspects of life. We find evidence of intentional burials, with bodies placed carefully and sometimes with grave goods, tools, ornaments, pigment. Some burials show evidence of red ochre being applied to the body, suggesting ritual significance. The frequency and care of burials suggest beliefs in an afterlife or in the spiritual significance of the dead. Some burials show evidence of food offerings or offerings of tools, suggesting beliefs that the dead had continued needs or could be honoured by living relatives. In some cases, burials show evidence of unusual treatment of the dead. In some later Paleolithic sites, skulls show evidence of being manipulated or fashioned into vessels, so-called skull cups. The cannibalism evidence at some sites remains controversial, but it suggests complex cultural practices around the dead, practices that we may not fully understand but that clearly held significance. Some scholars have suggested ritual cannibalism, the consumption of the dead as a way of honouring them or incorporating their power. Others have suggested that in extreme periods of resource stress, the consumption of the dead may have been a last resort survival strategy. To truly understand what early humans experienced, we need to look at the material evidence of daily life, the structures they built, the clothing they wore, the strategies they employed to survive in the frozen desert. The most spectacular evidence comes from the mammoth bone structures of the Don region in Ukraine. These structures, found at sites like Kostenki and Medjugorje, are remarkable for their sophistication and their use of mammoth bone. These structures are roughly circular, with frames constructed from large mammoth bones, skulls, mandibles, long bones, and presumably covered with hides or other materials. The largest of these structures could be several meters in diameter, providing shelter for a group of perhaps 10 to 20 people. The construction of such structures would have required considerable effort. Each mammoth skull weighs hundreds of kilograms. The bones would have been collected, possibly from natural deaths or from previous hunts, or from hunts specifically aimed at providing materials for construction. The bones would have been transported to the settlement site and arranged in the structure. If these were used as year-round dwellings, they would need to be substantial enough to provide real shelter from wind and cold. If they were seasonal structures, used during particular periods of the year, they might have been somewhat less substantial. The archaeological evidence suggests that these mammoth bone structures were used, but there is debate about whether they were used as primary dwellings or for other purposes. The debris associated with them, food remains, tool manufacturing debris, suggest they were indeed occupation sites. But some scholars suggest that the structures may have been primarily used during periods when mammoth hunting was feasible, and that seasonal occupation may have varied. In any case, the construction of these structures demonstrates considerable knowledge of engineering and materials, and considerable investment of labour. Most human habitation during the Last Glacial Maximum probably occurred in caves or rock shelters, which would have provided ready-made protection from the elements. The archaeological evidence shows intensive use of particular caves and rock shelters during this period. The fireplace evidence from these sites is abundant: ash layers, charred bone and wood, artifacts made from heat-treated stone. The concentration of debris around these fireplaces suggests that communal cooking and gathering occurred around these fires. The clothing worn during this period would have been essential for survival. We have direct evidence in the form of bone needles with eyes, suggesting that hides were sewn into fitted garments. The clothing would likely have consisted of fitted jackets or coats made from animal hide, with fur left on the inside for insulation. Leggings made from hide would have provided protection for the legs. Boots made from hide would have been essential for keeping feet dry and warm. Gloves or mittens would have been necessary for hand protection. The clothing would have been maintained carefully, damaged areas repaired, worn-out items replaced. A failure of clothing in extreme cold could mean frostbite and loss of extremities. Hair and body adornment seem to have been important as well. Bone and ivory ornaments have been found as pendants and beads. These may have been worn in the hair or sewn into clothing. The presence of these ornaments suggests that personal adornment and self-expression were valued even in these harsh conditions, or perhaps especially in these harsh conditions, as a way of maintaining individual identity and social status. The food procurement and storage strategies would have been carefully planned. The timing of migrations and hunts would be anticipated well in advance. Tools would be readied, drying racks would be constructed. When a successful hunt occurred, the processing would be rapid and systematic. The meat would be cut into strips and dried, creating a preserved food product that could be stored for months. The hides would be processed, scraped to remove flesh, worked with oils and brains to make them supple and waterproof. The bones would be processed, cracked to extract marrow, shaped into tools, accumulated for fuel. The sinews would be processed into cordage. The organization of labor would have been crucial. The processing of a large animal, a mammoth or multiple reindeer, would require the work of many hands, many people performing different specialized tasks. Women and children as well as men would participate. The knowledge of how to do these tasks would be transmitted through generations, with experienced people training younger people. The fire management would have been constant work. In the extreme cold of the Last Glacial Maximum, fire would be essential for warmth, for cooking, for tool making, heating stone to make it easier to flake, for light. Fuel would have been a precious commodity. In regions with limited wood, bone would be used as fuel. The collected bone from mammoth hunts provided enormous quantities of fuel. A single mammoth skeleton could provide fuel for substantial heating and cooking for a considerable period. The management of fire, keeping it going through the night, protecting it from wind, controlling it so it provided maximum benefit without wasting, would be a skilled practice. Water acquisition in a frozen landscape presents special challenges. Snow would have to be melted to obtain water, a process that requires substantial fuel. Springs that remained unfrozen were premium locations. The ability to locate such springs and to return to them reliably would be important. Settlement patterns would be oriented toward water sources. Sanitation and health in these conditions would be challenging. The accumulation of waste, both human waste and the debris from food processing, could create conditions favourable to disease. The concentration of people in shelters during winter would facilitate the spread of respiratory infections. Injuries from hunting accidents, from falls, from encounters with predators would need to be managed with limited medical knowledge and tools. Infections could be serious or fatal. Dental health would have been a concern, with wear on teeth from grinding stone particles mixed into food and from constant use of teeth in tool making and hide processing. Despite these challenges, the evidence suggests that people survived and lived reasonably well during the Last Glacial Maximum. The skeletal evidence from burials shows people of reasonable health, living into their 40s and 50s, though with some showing signs of nutritional stress or injury. Children were born and survived to adulthood. Communities persisted and grew. The cultural production, the art, the decorative objects, the burial goods, suggest that life had meaning and value beyond simple survival. Let your mind rest now on the image of a human family in a cave or shelter during the Last Glacial Maximum. The fire provides warmth and light. Outside, the wind howls and the cold is extreme, but inside there is relative safety and warmth. Perhaps a woman is scraping a hide, working the stone tool with practiced movements, knowing exactly the pressure and angle necessary to properly process the hide. Perhaps a man is working on a spear thrower, carefully carving and shaping bone to create a tool of great precision and beauty. Perhaps children are playing with toys, perhaps a carved figurine of an animal, or objects made from bone or stone. Perhaps an elder is telling stories, passing along knowledge and tradition to the younger generation. This image of daily life, mundane and ordinary yet remarkable in its resilience, is what we should carry forward. The sense of humans continuing to live, to work, to create, to teach, despite the hostility of the environment. The Last Glacial Maximum did not bring human habitation to an end. It transformed it, reshaped it, challenged it, but did not break it. The spiritual beliefs and practices of early humans during the Last Glacial Maximum are difficult to reconstruct with certainty, because we do not have written records, and the material evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. And yet, there is substantial evidence that spiritual life was important, that humans developed beliefs and practices that helped them make sense of their world and create community and meaning in the face of extreme challenges. The burials themselves provide one window into spiritual beliefs. The placement of grave goods, tools, ornaments, sometimes food remains, suggest beliefs in an afterlife or in the needs of the dead. The application of red ochre to burials or to the bodies themselves suggests symbolic meaning attached to colour. Red ochre was not a practical substance. It served no utilitarian purpose. Its presence in burials suggests ritual significance, perhaps a connection between red, the colour of blood, of life, and the transition of death. The care taken in placing the body, sometimes in a flexed position, sometimes extended, suggests ritual protocols around death. The evidence of skeletal manipulation in some burials is intriguing and difficult to interpret. The removal of skulls, the fashioning of skull cups, the evidence of defleshing before burial, all of this suggests complex ritual treatment of the dead. Some scholars have interpreted these practices as showing respect for the dead, a way of honouring them or keeping them present within the community. Others have suggested that the consumption of the dead may have been a way of incorporating the spiritual power of ancestors. The practice of creating skull cups from human skulls has been documented ethnographically in some cultures as a ritual practice with spiritual significance. The Venus figurines almost certainly had spiritual significance. The consistency of their appearance across vast geographic areas and long time periods suggests that they represented something of importance, something that was worth reproducing repeatedly across cultures and centuries. The explanations vary: fertility symbols, goddess figures, representations of ideal female form, symbols related to nutrition and survival. But whatever their specific meaning, their presence indicates that the spiritual life of these peoples included concepts related to the feminine, to reproduction to female power. The cave art shows evidence of spiritual practice as well. The hand stencils, hands outlined in pigment on cave walls, are deeply moving evidence of human presence and identity. These are not sophisticated representations of animals or elaborate artistic compositions. They are simple, direct, a human hand claiming existence and presence in a space. The act of creating a hand stencil, blowing pigment around the hand placed on the cave wall, is physically intimate, a direct contact with the space. The repetition of hand stencils in certain locations suggests that particular caves or sections of caves had spiritual significance. Perhaps these were sacred spaces where rituals were performed, where the dead were honoured, where communication with the spirit world occurred. The animal paintings show different kinds of spiritual significance. The realistic depictions of mammoths, horses, reindeer, and other animals suggest careful observation and artistic skill. But they likely also had spiritual meaning. In many hunting cultures, particularly those that practice shamanism, animals are understood as spiritual beings with power and agency. The depiction of animals in caves may have been a form of communication with animal spirits, a way of seeking their cooperation in hunts, a way of honouring them after death. Some paintings show animals with weapons protruding from their bodies, spear-like marks that might represent hunting magic, an attempt to magically control the hunt before it physically occurred. The use of ochre and other pigments appears throughout the material culture of this period. Red ochre, in particular, appears frequently in burials, on carved figurines, in cave paintings. Yellow ochre, though less frequent, also appears. The extraction and processing of ochre requires knowledge, knowing where to find it, how to mine it, how to powder it for use. The presence of ochre in burials and on ritual objects suggests it had symbolic significance, perhaps related to blood and life force, perhaps related to spiritual power or transformation. Shamanism, the practice by which individuals develop special relationships with spiritual entities, often through altered states of consciousness, and use these relationships to benefit the community, may have been practiced. The archaeological evidence cannot directly confirm shamanism, but certain features of the material culture are consistent with shamanic practice. The care taken in creating carved animal figurines, the presence of ochre in burial contexts, the positioning of skeletons in specific postures, all of these could be elements of shamanic ritual. If shamanism was indeed practiced, certain individuals would have held special status as intermediaries with the spirit world. These individuals might have been healers, counselors, spiritual guides. Their knowledge of plants with medicinal properties, knowledge of psychological techniques that could induce altered states of consciousness would have been highly valued. The concept of spiritual power or mani might have been important. Certain objects, carved figurines, tools of exceptional craftsmanship, items made from rare materials might have been understood as carriers of spiritual power. The movement of these objects through trade networks would not have been merely exchange of goods, but transfer of spiritual power and influence across distances. The possession of an object made from a rare material, perhaps from a far-off place, would have marked the owner as someone with status and connections, someone with access to spiritual power. The landscape itself would have been understood as spiritual. Specific caves, specific rock formations, specific water sources might have been understood as dwelling places of spirits, as locations where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Religious practice might have included pilgrimages to these sacred places, rituals performed at these locations, offerings made to the spirits. The gathering of a community at a sacred location for a spiritual ceremony would have reinforced group identity and cohesion. The night sky would have held spiritual significance. The stars were visible in remarkable detail in the clear, unpolluted air of the Ice Age. The moon's phases, the annual cycles of star visibility, the appearance of planets, all of these would have been observed and would have held meaning. Ceremonies might have been timed to lunar cycles or seasonal movements of stars. The heavens would have been understood as a realm of spirit and power, a place where the most important beings existed. Imagine participating in a spiritual ceremony during the Last Glacial Maximum. Perhaps it's a moonlit night, clear and cold. A group has gathered in a sheltered cave or at a sacred location. A spiritual leader, a shaman or priest, has prepared the space. Red ochre marks have been made on the rock walls. Carved figurines have been arranged. The people gather around a fire, the light casting moving shadows on the walls. The leader begins to chant or sing, invocations to the spirits, prayers for the success of upcoming hunts, for the health of the community, for protection from the harsh environment. The people join in, their voices blending, the sound echoing off the cave walls. The physical reality of the moment, the cold outside, the warmth of the fire, the presence of the community, combines with the spiritual reality being invoked. The boundary between the physical and spiritual seems thin. The spirits feel present. The power that is being invoked seems real and immediate. For the participants, this ceremony is not merely psychological or symbolic. It is real contact with spiritual reality, real communication with the powers that govern the world. After the ceremony, the community would feel strengthened. They would have renewed their connection with the spirits that sustain them. They would have reinforced their bonds with each other through shared participation in the ritual. The anxiety and uncertainty that comes from living in a harsh, dangerous world would have been temporarily assuaged through this spiritual practice. The creation of art, particularly the Venus figurines and other carved objects, may have been itself a spiritual practice. The act of carving a figure from bone or stone requires focus and intention. The hands must work carefully. The object emerges slowly from the raw material. For the person creating the object, this may have been a meditative practice, a form of spiritual discipline. The finished object carries the intention and spiritual energy of its creator. When given as a gift, when traded, when placed in a burial, it carries this spiritual significance. The integration of art, spirituality, and daily survival in these societies is remarkable. There was not a separation between the practical and the spiritual, between the material and the sacred. Everything was integrated. The hunt was both a practical activity for procuring food and a spiritual practice involving communication with animal spirits. The creation of tools was both a practical necessity and an expression of skill and artistry. The burial of the dead was both a practical necessity and a spiritual practice expressing beliefs about the afterlife. This integration suggests a wholeness of life, a sense that all aspects of existence were meaningful and connected. This spiritual framework that early humans developed did not separate them from the natural world, but rather integrated them into it, giving them a place and a role within a cosmos that was alive with spiritual power. Around 19,000 years ago, the climate began to ameliorate. The extreme cold of the Last Glacial Maximum gradually, then more rapidly, gave way to warmer conditions. This change was not instantaneous. It took place over centuries and millennia, but it represented a turning point, the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, at least this chapter of it. The first signs would have been subtle. The winters might have been slightly less severe. The spring thaw might have occurred slightly earlier. The growing season for plants might have extended somewhat. But as time went on, the changes became more dramatic. The permafrost that had extended far south began to retreat northward. The ice sheets that had covered Scandinavia and northern Europe began to thin and shrink. The vast expanses of steppe began to transition. Forest began to advance from the refugia where they had survived. The climate that had been stable, if harsh, during the last glacial maximum became unstable, fluctuating, changing more rapidly. This warming had significant consequences for human populations. The refugial populations that had concentrated in southwestern France, Iberia, the Mediterranean, and the East began to expand. As territories that had been uninhabitable became habitable again, human groups moved northward and eastward, recolonizing regions that had been abandoned during the most extreme cold. The archaeological evidence shows this expansion clearly. Sites that had been abandoned during the last glacial maximum again show evidence of human occupation. Previously marginal regions became prime settlement areas as warming progressed. The fauna changed as well. The mammoth herds, which had never been abundant during the most extreme cold, became even rarer. The specialized steppe fauna that had adapted to the extreme cold began to disappear or retreat northward. The reindeer, still important, began to show different movement patterns as vegetation patterns changed. New animal species became available as prey. The horse, in particular, became increasingly important in hunting economies. Elk and aurochs appeared in regions where they had not been present during the last glacial maximum. The vegetation transformation was profound. The steppe, which had dominated the landscape, began to transition. In some regions, this transition led to forest development. In other regions, grasslands persisted but with different species composition. The Mediterranean and southern regions became warmer and more Mediterranean-like in climate. The northern regions, though still cold and harsh by modern standards, became substantially warmer than they had been. This environmental transformation required human populations to adapt once again. The strategies that had worked during the last glacial maximum were no longer fully effective. The distributions of animals changed, requiring new knowledge of where to find prey. The plants that provided gathered food resources changed, requiring relearning of where to find these resources and when they were available. The landscape itself changed, making old settlement locations less attractive and previously marginal locations more attractive. The archaeological evidence shows rapid cultural change during this transition period. New tool types appear. The Solitarian culture, which had flourished in southwestern France and Iberia, gradually was replaced by the Magdalenian culture. The Magdalenian is characterized by different stone tools, by particularly sophisticated bone and antler working, by extensive use of long projectile points that appear particularly well suited to hunting game species. The Magdalenian culture appears to have been especially successful at hunting reindeer, with the subsistence economy focused heavily on these animals. The expansion northward and eastward during the post-Last Glacial Maximum period is dramatic in the archaeological record. Sites that had been abandoned during the peak glaciation were reoccupied. New sites appeared in regions that had been completely uninhabitable during the most extreme cold. The human population began to expand from its refugial concentrations. This expansion was not instantaneous, but took place over centuries. It appears that some routes northward were faster than others, Some regions were occupied sooner than others, but the overall pattern is one of relatively rapid recolonization of previously glaciated territories. The genetic evidence supports this archaeological picture. The ancient DNA of populations from the post-glacial period shows ancestry tracing back to the refugial populations. Populations in different regions show genetic signatures tracing to the particular refugia from which they expanded. The southern Iberian refuge population expanded northward into Central Europe. The Mediterranean refuge populations expanded into the Balkans and into Greece. The eastern refuge populations expanded northward into what is now Russia and eastward toward Asia. The recolonization was not a simple northward migration from a single refuge, but rather multiple expansions from multiple centers, resulting in the complex genetic structure of modern European populations. Imagine being part of a human group during this transition period. Your parents and grandparents lived in the refugial region, confined to a relatively small territory. But now, as an adult, you are part of a group that is expanding into new territories. Your group follows the herds northward as the climate becomes more favorable. You and your hunting companions are discovering new territories, places that your ancestors had never been, places that are now becoming habitable. The landscape is becoming more diverse. Forests are appearing alongside grasslands, creating new habitats and new opportunities. The challenges are different from what your ancestors faced during the Last Glacial Maximum, but they are still significant. The knowledge that your ancestors accumulated about survival in extreme cold is still valuable, but you are learning new things as well, new strategies suited to the changing environment. The expansion from refugial populations to recolonize the continent represents one of the great human achievements. It required courage as groups ventured into unknown territories. It required flexibility as people adapted their hunting and gathering strategies to new environments. It required social organization sufficient to coordinate multiple groups and manage relationships across distance as populations expanded and regrouped in new territories. The recolonization of Europe after the Last Glacial Maximum set the stage for all subsequent European prehistory. The cultures and populations that developed from these post-glacial expansions would eventually develop agriculture, create writing, establish states and empires. But it all began with this recolonization, this expansion of human populations from the refugia where they had persisted through the ice. As we come to the end of this journey through the Last Glacial Maximum, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've encountered. We have journeyed back 26,000 years to witness a world that was profoundly different from our own, a world of ice and wind and extreme challenge. We have encountered humans, people with minds as sophisticated as ours, emotions as complex as ours, creativity and drive equal to our own, who lived and survived and even flourished in that world. These people were your ancestors. The DNA that makes up your body, the genetic inheritance that you carry, passed through the bottleneck of the Last Glacial Maximum. Your ancestors were among the survivors who concentrated in refugial regions, who maintained communities and culture under extreme stress, who developed the knowledge and skills necessary to persist when the world seemed hostile to human existence. The traditions that they developed, the stories they told, the beliefs they held, the ways they organized their societies, all of this passed forward through the generations. Some of it survives in modified form in modern human cultures. Some of it is lost, preserved only in the archaeological record and in our imaginative reconstructions. What can we learn from these ancestors? Perhaps the first lesson is about resilience. Your ancestors faced challenges that we can barely imagine. They lived with danger and hardship as constants in their lives. They adapted, they created, they persisted. They did not merely survive, they developed sophisticated culture, created art and beauty, built complex social systems. If they could persist through such challenges, we can certainly persist through the challenges we face. Perhaps the second lesson is about connection to place. Your ancestors knew their territories intimately. They knew every rock, every watercourse, every distinctive feature. They had stories about these places. They understood themselves as part of these landscapes, not separate from them. In our modern world, many of us are disconnected from the places we live. We do not know the birds and animals of our region. We do not understand the seasonal patterns. We are not rooted. Perhaps reconnecting with place, understanding our dependence on the natural world, would strengthen us as it strengthened our ancestors. Perhaps the third lesson is about community and social bonds. Your ancestors lived in groups. They depended on each other for survival. They maintained trade relationships across distances. They created social bonds that lasted a lifetime, that were cemented in ritual and ceremony. In our modern world, we are often isolated, surrounded by people yet alone. Perhaps strengthening community bonds, creating rituals that bring people together, valuing social relationships as our ancestors did, would improve our lives and our well-being. Perhaps the fourth lesson is about spirituality and meaning-making. Your ancestors understood themselves as part of a spiritual cosmos. They created art and ritual to express their spirituality. They understood their survival, not merely as a practical matter, but as connected to spiritual forces. They found meaning in their existence, found purpose in their activities. In our often secular modern world, we sometimes struggle to find meaning. Perhaps learning from the way our ancestors integrated spirituality into all aspects of life could offer us wisdom. Finally, perhaps the lesson is about adaptability itself. The Last Glacial Maximum required adaptation at every level: technological, social, spiritual. Your ancestors met this challenge. They did not cling to outmoded strategies. They innovated, they experimented, they transformed their cultures to fit new circumstances. As we face our own environmental challenges and social transformations, this capacity for adaptation may be among our most valuable inheritances. As you rest now in comfort, as your body settles into sleep, take a moment to appreciate what you carry in your very being. The genetic inheritance of survivors, the cultural inheritance of innovators, the knowledge of humans who persisted in the face of extreme challenge. You are descended from some of the toughest, most resilient people ever to walk the earth. This strength is in you. This adaptability is in you. This capacity to create beauty and meaning in the face of hardship is in you. The frozen desert that our ancestors saw 26,000 years ago is gone. The ice has melted. The climate has warmed. The landscape has transformed. But the human spirit that persisted through those extreme conditions, the creativity that found expression even in the most challenging circumstances, the social bonds that held communities together, the spiritual meaning that gave life purpose, these things endure. They are part of your inheritance. They are part of who you are. As you drift towards sleep now, you carry with you the knowledge of where you come from, the understanding that you are part of an unbroken chain of humans extending back through 40 generations to that frozen desert world. You are here because your ancestors persisted, adapted, created, and survived. You carry their strength. You carry their knowledge. You carry their resilience. Sleep well, knowing that you are the descendant of survivors, the heir to a legacy of human persistence and adaptation that extends back beyond memory, back through the ice, back to the beginning of human time. Your ancestors made it through the frozen desert. You can face whatever challenges come your way. If you found this journey through deep history meaningful, I would be deeply grateful if you would consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. More stories from the ancient world, more explorations of how humans persisted and created and survived through profound challenges are coming. There are so many incredible stories from our past waiting to be told, waiting to connect us with the resilience and creativity of our ancestors. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for journeying back through time to that frozen desert world. May you sleep peacefully, knowing where you come from and who you are. Good night.